The interest in this program, is being really quite overwhelming. I think this is a very positive sign that there's so much interest among researchers in the region about sort of improving their what we've called soft skills. We have more than, as of today, more than 1,100 researchers from across ASEAN and beyond who've registered. So this is we're delighted. This is a great number, clear indication of the kind of interest in what these webinars are designed to address. This program, the ASEAN BCG Research Development Program, it's an initiative of Thailand's Program Management Unit for Human Resources and Institutional Development, Research and Innovation, which is quite a mouthful, but you can also address them as PMUB. They're here in Thailand, and it's really because of their vision and their generous support that we're all here today. And NASDA, or NSTDA, we're implementing this program in partnership with our good friends at Euraxis ASEAN. And maybe just before we get started, I'll let Jenny, who's one of the regional representatives for Euraxis ASEAN, briefly introduce herself and what Euraxis is all about and how Euraxis can help you as a researcher. So Jenny, quick intro from you.
Thank you so much, Simon. I am very excited for today. You know, we are bringing together two of the most important topics, I think, that we as researchers and scientists have to know. One, of course, is the BCG model that Thailand is promoting, which is an integration of bioeconomy, circular economy, and green economy. And of course, science communication, which is very, very important right now, communicating science. And so for us at Euraxis ASEAN, we are very, very happy to be part of this. Thank you so much to NASDA and our colleagues as well with PMUB. So Euraxis ASEAN is part of an international research action initiative. And we are launched by the European Commission to promote research careers and facilitate mobility of researchers across Europe and beyond. So we are a platform for researchers, but also for entrepreneurs, for universities and businesses to interact with each other. And we connect people, projects, and funding. So we have regular info sessions. Perhaps some of you have already joined us. I hope so. Practical trainings as well, matchmaking events, mentoring, and of course, events such as this, that where we partner with NASDA. We've been partnering with NASDA for quite some time, and we are very, very happy always to lend a hand. Also, I wanted to also inform you that we have a newsletter, and we try to have a curated list of opportunities for collaboration in research and innovation here and in Europe and in ASEAN. So please keep in touch with us. I'll put some links on the chat, but while doing that, thank you so much for joining us. And again, Simon, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Jenny. And yes, let me just reinforce what Jenny said. Euraxis is a fantastic initiative, and it's a great opportunity for you here in ASEAN to keep track and find funding opportunities and research partners from across ASEAN, but also globally. So do click on those links that Jenny will be sharing, and take advantage of the great services they offer. So now let me just give you a brief overview of the ASEAN BCG Research and Development Program. Some of you have already seen this if you joined us at our last event, but maybe just to remind you what the objectives are and what the next sessions are that we're planning in the weeks and months ahead. So could I please ask my NASDA colleagues to share the overview presentation? I think there's a couple of slides before that, I think. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, so the ASEAN BCG Research and Development Program, as I say, this is something that was initiated by PMUB here in Thailand. And it is being supported and implemented by both NSTDA and Euraxis with Jenny and her colleague Susanna. The program consists of two phases. So we're in the first phase right now. And this is really about, it's a sort of series of workshops that are designed to improve really essential researcher skills. So these are sort of soft skills, as we call them, topics like critical thinking, science communication, networking, research career development, et cetera. So that's the idea for this first phase. And then at the end of the first phase, there'll be 30 researchers selected to participate in an on-site program here in Thailand. This will be a 5 days workshop where you will have an opportunity to work with mentors to basically develop your research idea, maybe your funding proposal, to develop that with the help of mentors and basically get it into a form that you can use to apply for various international programs. It's not tailored to any one funding program, but also give you a proposal that you can also share readily with your colleagues in the region and elsewhere. Obviously, the focus will be on BCG, and this is, the reason for this is that these are designed to be research proposals, research ideas that can address some of these global challenges. Next slide, please. As I say, the second phase will be here in Thailand. What we're looking for in terms of the candidate profile is a doctoral degree or at least 3 years of equivalent research experience, that you're affiliated or working with a research institution here in ASEAN, and that you've got excellent English communication skills, written and spoken. How we're going to choose the 30, we had many questions last time how this selection process is going to take place, because we've got, obviously 100 signed up for the overall program for phase one. What we'll be doing at the end of phase one is taking a look at who was actively participating through the various workshops and seminars. And then we will ask you to basically write a short expose explaining how your own research, your research ideas, how that connects with BCG and how it addresses, or your idea potentially addresses, needs here in ASEAN, needs globally. And then there'll be some supporting documentation that you'll require, nothing too onerous. And we'll announce the sort of finalists, the 30 finalists, at the beginning of June this year. Next. So here's a quick overview of phase one. So many of you joined the first workshop a couple of weeks ago. That was really providing an overview of BCG, SDGs, what's happening at the ASEAN level through the ASEAN Secretariat S&T division. Today's the first workshop in session 2 on science communication. And then next week, we'll have another one on critical thinking, design thinking in particular, and how that can be used to develop your research career. Then we have sessions on research management and international collaboration. Then we move to session 3, and this is really about journal writing and proposal writing, journal writing for scientific journals, proposal writing for international funding programs, and then scientific presentation skills. And then the last session is focused really on building up your networking skills, how you can, as a researcher, say in Vietnam or Indonesia, how you can kind of build up an international network here with colleagues in ASEAN, but also internationally. So that's the overview of the program. Next slide, please. And here we are back to today's session. So I would just like to say that I think I told this to a few of you at the beginning of the session. Please ask lots of questions. You can do this through the upcoming session at any time by typing in the chat box. But we've also set aside 30 minutes at the end where you can, basically it's an open forum. So you're free to ask any questions, share your thoughts on communication, etc. Today's workshop is called How to Communicate Your Science Effectively. And we are very fortunate to have an excellent speaker with us today. He is not new to presentations in ASEAN. He's given some similar workshops in the past. And why we've invited him back today is because he is very good at what he does. We will also be sharing a video of today's meeting with all the participants. So if you don't catch everything that Sam says and maybe your question doesn't get answered, we'll be following up with you with the recording of today's presentation. So let's get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Sam Illingworth. He's an associate professor in academic practice at the Edinburgh Napier University in Scotland. He is an internationally recognized expert in science communication with close to 70 publications and an H-index of 18. And Sam's work has been covered by Scientific American, BuzzFeed, Nature, Public Library of Science, and The Conversation, among others. And Sam joins us today from his home in Scotland in the UK. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm just going to start sharing my presentation.
Yep.
And I appreciate that for some people, English isn't their first language. So I've also, in the chat, I've just put a link to the slides so people can feel free to follow along as well in their spare time. And as Simon has said, this will be recorded. So just to preface all of this by saying I'm really excited to be here. I've put all of my contact information there purposefully because, as I will come to in this presentation, I love collaborating and I love hearing from people. So make a note of it, get in contact with me at any time. We've got 30 minutes at the end of today's session for as many questions as you want, but my inbox, my Zoom, my Twitter handle are always open, and we'll come on to collaboration a bit later on as well. We're going to stop in about 45, 50 minutes for a brief break to allow people to get a comfort break and grab something to drink as well, and then we'll start again. And just a very brief background on myself. So I have a PhD in atmospheric physics, but my research really is involved in trying to develop conversations between science and non-scientists and trying to encourage and develop ways of communicating science effectively to different audiences. And the purpose of today's workshop presentation is exactly that. So there's a lot to cover, but I hopefully you find it interesting. Please feel free to drop things into the chat and I'll try to pick them up as we go. And similarly, just really do write down some good questions so that we've got them at the end and we can answer as many as we want. But again, feel free to take a note of my contact details so we can get in touch with me as we go. So I'm going to start really by framing this whole presentation, this whole workshop around what is impact. Because really, I think most of you are probably here because you want to find out how to make your science more impactful, how to make your research more impactful. But what do I mean by impact? So a really good definition of impact, a contemporary definition, is the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society. So what that means is, I'm sure many of you are doing amazing research in your laboratories, out in the field, on your computers, but how are we making sure that that research gets out to the wider society and contributes to it positively? And in order for us to be excellent researchers, excellent scientific researchers in the 21st century, it's no longer enough to just do the science. We also need to think about how we can communicate it and how we can develop a strategy so that our research has a positive impact on society, and similarly, society helps to drive our research. So I want to really think about the two faces of impact. We have the inward-facing side of impact and the outward-facing side. So the inward-facing side is really thinking about how we can communicate our science and make an impact to other scientists, to other researchers. So how can we communicate our work? Is it through publications? Is it through webinars? Is it through conferences? Is it through posters? And we'll touch on many of these here, but how we can basically ensure that our research reaches as many people in the field as is necessary for it to make an impact. And secondly, and the thing that I think scientists don't really do a very good job of all the time, is the outward facing side. So how can we ensure that our research has an impact with non-scientists? So we'll come on to that again in the presentation, but thinking about journalists, thinking about policymakers, thinking about community groups. And I want to be upfront about this. It's really important that we do this because scientists have an obligation to improve society and to listen to society and to develop our research to be a positive good. But on a purely selfish level, if our research is impactful, if it's read by lots of people, if it's used by policymakers, if it's picked up by journalists, if it's published in high impact journals, that means that we will have very successful careers as well. So yes, we need to be altruistic and make sure that our research positively benefits society. But a happy side effect of that is that we will also have illustrious and successful careers as scientists and as scientific researchers as well. I want to start by framing all of this with a really useful model. So this is a model called the triangle of effective communication. Now, there are many, many different models for communicating effectively, communicating science effectively, and just communicating effectively. And there's a really good model that was developed by two business leaders called Peck and Dickinson in 2009. And I've adapted that really to create this model that I'm sharing with you today. And this tells us that in order for effective communication, so in order for us to communicate our research effectively, we need to think about three things. We need to think about the narrative, so that's what we're saying. We need to think about the audience, so that's who we're saying it to. And we need to think about the self, so that's how we're saying it, how we're presenting ourselves. And if you remember one thing from this whole workshop, it would be this triangle. So however you're communicating your work, if you're communicating it to a supervisor, if you're communicating it to a prime minister, if you're communicating it to your 5-year-old nephew, always think about these three things. Narrative, what am I saying? Audience, who am I saying it to? And self, how am I saying it? And if you get these three things right, you will be able to communicate effectively. So let's start by thinking about connecting with audiences, because really for me, this is the most important thing. Your message and the way that you communicate will change depending on your audience. And there are many different audiences. So one of the most effective ways of communicating to an audience is through storytelling. And these two quotes are taken from a really nice article around the soul of science communication from the Journal of Science Communication, JCOM, in 2019, where the authors say that all animals and many plants communicate in one way or another, but only humans tell stories. Storytelling is arguably the defining characteristic of humans that sets us apart from the animal kingdom. Ancient societies told stories around campfires and painted murals about their hunting expeditions on the walls of caves. This enabled our ancestors to process information and make meaning of their shared experiences. So storytelling in all cultures is a really, really powerful medium to enable us to communicate. So why don't we do it in science? Many very, very good communicators in science do. And so I'm inviting us to really think about telling a story with our science, because that is a really effective way of communicating to audiences. Audiences around the world are used to stories. We read books, we watch films, we play video games, we embrace culture, and throughout that culture we have stories. So we need to think about telling stories with our science as well in order to have a big impact. So there's lots of different storytelling structures, and I'm conscious that the storytelling structures I'm going to be talking to you today about are grounded in a Western perspective, because that's my background, that's my heritage. However, I know that many of you have different backgrounds and that you have your own storytelling and your own storytelling techniques. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of storytelling structures today, but I would invite you to think about your own cultural stories as well. Again, especially thinking about your audiences. If you're speaking to a specific cultural group, maybe you could use a storytelling approach that is specific or accepted by that group in order to communicate your research effectively. But the most basic model of storytelling is really this 3-act structure. So this is adopted from Aristotle's Poetics, going back to the ancient Greeks. And we really think about a story as having 3 parts: a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the great thing is that actually we can break down our science and our scientific story into these 3 things. So we can think about the beginning, the context, the rationale. So why did we want to do this? Where was the gap in the field? Where did the need for this scientific research come from? We have the middle, the juicy bit, the methods, the results, the analysis. So having decided on what we're going to do, what did we actually do? What did we find? How did we find it? And then we have the end, so the conclusions and the future plans. So going back to the beginning, where we might have set a hypothesis, did we answer that hypothesis? How did we meet the rationale? How did we fit into that context? What might this mean for other researchers and for ourselves going forward as well? So I'm just going to answer a question that's coming up in the chat a lot. People are asking where the recordings are going to be. They're going to be shared, I believe, with you via email after this. So don't worry, they will be made available to you. And that Dropbox link as well is on the screen for you all to have. And just again, so you've got it, I've put it in the chat. There's a link to the slides. So don't worry, the video recording will be made available to you. So this is the 3-act structure, thinking about the beginning, the context and rationale, thinking about the middle, the methods, the results and the analysis, and then thinking about the end. What did we find? How did we answer or not that hypothesis? But then we can get a little bit more complicated. So that's a very basic structure for storytelling: beginning, middle, end. A slightly more complex structure would be the one here. So this is adopted from Freytag's pyramid. And this is one that we would find very much in a lot in movies, for example. So we have an exposition where we set the scene. We have rising action, where something very exciting is happening. We have the climax, we have the falling action, and then we have the denouement, where everything's wrapped up neatly in a little bow. And again, in science, what does this look like? Well, we have the why are you doing this at the beginning, setting the scene. Rising action, how are you doing this? Like, what are you doing? What results are you trying to find? How are you going to go about doing it? The climax, what did you find? What were your results? Dropping action again, what does this mean? And then finishing off with the denouement of, why did you do this? What does this mean going forward? How do we wrap this up with relation to the original why? So again, this is about thinking of using storytelling techniques to communicate your research so that it's interesting, so that it's accessible, and so that it taps into structures that audiences already know about. Storytelling. Storytelling is a very powerful way of communicating your science effectively. And before I go on to jargon and talking about jargon, again, I would just remind you all to think about the stories of your cultures, the stories of your childhoods, the stories of your lives. Like, what story structures can you use to be able to contextualize and communicate your research to others as well? So let's think about jargon. Now, as I've put there, introducing a large collections of words that are alien to your audience is the quickest way to disengage them with your subject matter. So what I mean by that is, a lot of us who work in scientific research, we've been working there for years, if not decades, and certain phrases, especially acronyms, are second nature to us, and we understand what they mean because we use them on a daily, if not an hourly basis. But it's really important to think about our audience and think about what they know, because we don't want to just start throwing random words at them that they won't understand, because then rather than listening to you, they will be concentrating on that word thinking, what does that mean? I don't understand it. And they will lose what you are trying to say. So as I put in the second bullet point there, there's nothing wrong with introducing new terminology, but be sure to explain exactly what you mean by it, ideally by contextualizing the term. If you're introducing a very specific form or a specific term, it's a classification of a specific animal species, be it a acronym describing a scientific project, be it a model that people have never heard of before, it's fine to use that word, but explain what you mean by it, because then you will not only help the audience to understand what you're talking about, but you will also remove any ambiguity. Because as I've said there, in the third bullet point, jargon isn't just those words that are not understood, but also words or phrases that may have different meaning depending on the field of expertise. So I've put as an example there, if you're talking about long time scales, the understanding of what a long time scale is very different depending on if you're a meteorologist dealing with the weather, or a paleontologist and dealing with dinosaurs and the development of life on Earth. So when you use words, when you use phrases, don't use too many of them, explain them carefully, and always add context, because otherwise what happens is that people might assume something that's very different. A very good example of this when we're talking to non-scientists is when we use the word error, because when we as scientists talk about errors, we're talking about very different things to what a non-scientific audience might perceive. For me as a scientist, an error is a margin by which I don't fully understand something, or by which I have a buffer zone. Whereas for a non-scientific audience, a lot of people equate the word error with mistake, which is very, very different. So whenever we're using words, especially to people who are not experts in our field, make sure that we explain them, make sure that we contextualize them, and make sure that we remove any ambiguity by giving context. So another way that we can really give context is by framing. So this is probably a concept that's new to you. So as to avoid jargon, I'm going to explain what I mean by framing, and I'm going to present context as well. So this is a really nice quote from a paper in Science from 2007. And they say that frames organize central ideas, defining a controversy to resonate with core values and assumptions. Frames pare down complex issues by giving some aspects greater emphasis. They allow citizens to rapidly identify why an issue matters, who might be responsible, and what should be done. So, in other words, as I've written here, framing theory suggests that how something is presented to the audience, i.e. the frame, i.e. the frame influences how it is processed. So framing involves explaining and describing the context of the problem to gain the most support from your audience. And so understanding the needs and experiences of your audience is key. What does this mean? What this basically means is that framing is about understanding your audience's needs, understanding your audience's experiences, understanding your audience beliefs, their ideals, and presenting your work or your science in a way that is most likely to appeal to them. So I'll go on to give some examples here, but for example, if we're talking about let's say research into the effects of the climate crisis on rising sea level. If we're talking to an audience and just say to them, oh, climate change is definitely happening and you are all to blame for this, that is not an effective way of trying to communicate and frame your work so that people listen to what you have to say. So really think about people's needs, think about their beliefs, and then develop it accordingly. So an example of framing is that in 2009, a study found that this is taken from a paper in 2009 from the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. And basically what they found was that in 2009, they had a conference, and they tried to offer this conference to PhD students. And to some of the PhD students, they said to them, okay, if you register for this conference early, you will get a discount and it will be cheaper. And to another group of PhD students, they said to them, if you register for this conference late, there will be a penalty fee for that late registration. Now, the date was exactly the same. So basically they said, for example, to one group, if you register before the 1st of March, you will get a discount on the registration. And they said to the other group, if you register after the 1st of March, you will be fined, or you will have to pay more for the registration. The fees were the same as well. But what was really interesting is, because some people had this framed as an opportunity, whereas others had it framed as a penalty, 93% of people who had it framed as a penalty decided to register early, whereas only 67% of them decided to register early when it was framed as a discount. So really thinking about the language and the way that we frame it is very, very important. So another thing to really think about that's important when we consider how to communicate our science effectively is rhetoric. So this is defined again by Aristotle as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So what I mean by this is that there's 3 different sections. There's ethos, there's logos, and there's pathos or pathos. Just to let people know as well, for some unknown reason, people have permission to draw on my presentation at the moment, which is fine. I'll reset it in the break, but that's where those yellow lines have come from. Somebody seems to have drawn a little bit on it. Don't worry, you can still read what's there and it's fine. So rhetoric really was developed by many people in ancient Greek as a way of trying to communicate and ensure that people listened to what you had to say. And Aristotle broke this down into 3 main areas: into ethos, into logos, and into pathos. And I'm just going to deal with each of these in turn. So ethos depends upon the moral character of the speaker. So it's an appeal to the ethics, and it's a means of convincing someone of the character or the credibility of the persuader. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is it's about convincing the audience that you as the speaker are an expert and are worth listening to. So the example I've given at the bottom is my 3 decades of experience in public service, my tireless commitment to the people of this community, and my willingness to reach across the aisle and cooperate with the opposition make me the ideal candidate for your mayor. So you can imagine a mayoral candidate using his credibility to try to communicate to the audience. Another example of this is how at the very beginning of this presentation, Simon kindly introduced me and built me up as an expert, which I am, with a high H index and a large number of publications, because by doing so, it means that you're more likely to rely on me as a credible speaker. If I just have turned up to this presentation and said, I'm late, I don't really know what I'm talking about, help me, you would have had less confidence in what I wanted to say. So ethos is an appeal to the credibility of the speaker. And the great thing is that as scientists, you have a lot of credibility. So when you're presenting your work, when you're talking to an audience, just take a little bit of time to outline why you are an expert in this field, which you are. Even if you're a PhD researcher in a particular field of research, you're still in the top 0.01% in the world that understands that field. So be sure to be confident in your expertise as a scientist and use it to appeal to the credibility of yourself. So logos is the speech itself insofar as it proves or seems to prove. In other words, it's an appeal to logic. It's a way of persuading an audience by reason. So again, at the bottom, I've imagined we were a lawyer and a judge saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have not only the fingerprints, the lack of an alibi, a clear motive, and an expressed desire to commit the robbery. We also have video of the suspect breaking in. The case could not be more open and shut. And the great thing about science is that we have that logic. You know, we have a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, we revisit that hypothesis. There's a fantastic logic to our argument. And actually, when we look at people using rhetoric for illicit means, they often have a lack of logic. So sometimes our job as scientists is to point out the baseless rhetoric or the lack of logical argument in presentations that we might see from, for example, sometimes politicians or journalists, where, not all the time, but sometimes where they make arguments that appeal to emotions rather than having logic. So if we're conducting our science ethically, then we don't need to worry about this, because we always have an appeal to the logic. We have the beginning, so we have the hypothesis, we test the hypothesis, we revisit that hypothesis, beginning, middle, end. And then finally, pathos, which is putting the hearer in a certain frame of mind. So I think pathos is probably the strongest element of rhetoric, and it's an appeal to passion. It's a way of convincing an audience of an argument by creating an emotional response. So, you know, for example, if we wanted to move because of a natural disaster, we might say, if we don't move soon, we're all going to die. Can't you see how dangerous it would be to stay? So what we need to do is we need to appeal to the emotions of our audience. And as scientists, we're not always very good at doing this. So sometimes as scientists, we're told to only present the cold, hard facts. And I disagree with that. I think when we conduct our scientific research, we should be very objective. But when we talk about our science, I think it's okay to show emotion. Imagine if we're a researcher researching the climate crisis, or researching food scarcity, or researching the refugee crisis. It's very hard for us to talk about that without getting emotional. A lot of my work is about effective communication around the climate crisis, especially for vulnerable audiences. And when I talk about it, I get angry and I get upset and I get emotive because it's an emotional topic. Similarly, if we're talking about research that's exciting or that's, you know, strange or funny, it's okay to display this emotion, and doing so appeals to the emotion of the audience and makes our research more likely to be accepted and communicated to them. So rhetoric, ethos, an appeal to the credibility of the speaker, logos, an appeal to the logic of the argument, and pathos, an appeal to the emotion of the audience. So use rhetoric in your science story. Again, reminding you that rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Ethos is an appeal to the ethics, credibility of the persuader. Logos is an appeal to logic, persuade the audience by reason. And pathos is an appeal to the passion, convince the audience by creating an emotional response. Just to remind you again of the triangle of effective communication, we think about the narrative, so that's what we're saying. We think about the audience, so that's who we're saying it to. And we think about the self, so that's how we're saying it. And in order for us to effectively communicate our research and develop impact, we need to think about all these three things. The narrative, what we're saying, how we can use story to develop that, the audience, who we're saying it to, and the self, how we're saying, what is our credibility? Why do people want to listen to what we have to say? So let's think about the key messages with regard to audience. Impact can be thought of as inward facing, so talking to other scientists, other researchers, and outward facing, talking to non-scientists. Remember the triangle of effective communication. Narrative, what we're saying, audience, who we're saying it to, self, how we're saying it. Use rhetoric to construct your narrative. So think about the appeal to ethos, your credibility as a speaker, logos, the logic of your argument, and pathos, the emotional response of your audience. And then use framing to consider your audience. What do you know about them? What do you understand about them? What are their beliefs? What are their hopes? What are their ideals? And how can you frame your research so that people are more likely to listen to what you have to say? So how do we get, thinking about that inward facing again, how do you get your paper seen by other scientists? This is something I get asked all the time. You know, let's be honest, we live in an environment in which we have to publish research, and we want that research to be well cited and to be well viewed. The first thing I would say is make it free to access. So try to publish in open access journals. Use your research repository at your university or institute, and then also use ResearchGate, which is an online, I guess, social media platform for scientists and researchers. By making it free to access, there's lots of research that shows you will have more citations, more people will read it, more people will cite it, more people will use it. Almost every journal now, without exception, has an open access route. So you might have to pay a little bit more through an article processing charge through your institute, but it will mean it is read. So the best advice I can give, first of all, for how more people read your papers is to make it free to access. Share across all media. And again, we're going to come on to talk about developing social media in the second part of this talk. Think about all your social media platforms, think about your email handles, think about everything, and just share it as much as you can. When I publish a research paper, as I'll talk about here, I put it in my email signature, I put it in my Twitter handle, I put it on my blog, I put it in my LinkedIn, I put it in my Facebook, I put it on presentations that I give. Just keep talking about it in every single situation so that people can encounter it as much as possible. And updating your email signature with your latest scientific paper is a very good way, because people will see it, especially if it's got an evocative title, and then click on it through. Another thing is to connect with people you cite. So what I do is I obviously use references in my papers. And when I think about the references, I look through them and I think, okay, who am I inspired by? Who would I like to work with? And who is doing work that I would like to be involved with? So rather than just citing people in a paper, what I do is, after I've cited people and I've had my own research paper published, I email those people and say, hey, I was really interested and inspired by your work, and you're cited in this paper that I did. And then sometimes we'll follow up with, do you want to collaborate or do you want to work together? And this is a great way of building your networks. And you don't have to be an extrovert. You can just send an email and people will be very complimented because you've cited their work. So I would say, hey, I've published this paper on the future of conferences. I was really inspired by your work. I've cited it here. If there's any opportunity for us to work together now or in the future, please let me know, as I'd love to do so. And not only is this starting to build connections, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it also means these people that you've cited will read your work because you've just emailed them about it. Inform your research institute and funder. So every single time you publish a paper, let your research institute know. And sometimes they'll make a news story about it, like my previous institute did here. And your funder might do the same as well. So at the very least, they'll probably share it on their social media channels, or they'll be aware that you're doing great research in this field. So whenever you do work, share it with your research institute, share it with your funder, and ask them to develop it and to maybe share it more widely. So key messages for getting your paper read: make it free to access, share across all media, update your email signature, connect with the people you cite. It takes you 2 minutes to write an email to say, I've cited you in this paper, have a read, let me know what you think, would love to collaborate. And inform your research institute and funder. So We're going to go on now to think about, and I'm going to talk probably for about 5 or 6 more minutes, and then we'll go for a break, about engaging with policymakers. So policymakers are a really key audience. They're an audience that can use your work and can develop really meaningful impact. So there's lots of different policymakers. There's obviously politicians, but there's also school governors, there's CEOs of large organizations, there's hospital administrators. It's basically people who can make a change to policy. And why you want to work with them is that if you have research that can be beneficial to them and to the organization they work with, be it industry, be it healthcare, be it schools, be it government more broadly, or local councils, this is a really meaningful and obvious way of generating impact. Remember, think back to that earlier definition of impact about making a positive difference to society. If you get your research in front of these people and contextualize it for them and frame it for them, providing it's relevant, of course, this is how your work can make an impact. This is how you improve your profile. This is how you become a very successful and well-recognized scientist, or it's one of the ways in which you can do so. Read policy reports. So in the UK, we have these things called post notes, which are really, really good. They're basically prepared for ministers and politicians as like a 2 or 3 pager so that they get an overview of it. A recent report in Thailand with the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy Review. Read these reports, get in contact with the people who write them, volunteer yourself to write for them, see where your research fits in. Contribute evidence. So again, I've just highlighted here, I go on the UK government website and just see where there's a call for evidence. In all of your countries, there'll be a similar thing. You just need to find where there's a call for evidence at the local politician level, at the national level. Get in contact with people and say, hey, I've got some work that's relevant to this field. I would like to give an oral or written communication. And then you can start to develop that relationship. And this is a copy of a policy report that I contributed to for the UK government on net zero. And again, this just looks good for your institute if you're working with the government in developing research. Connect with people, look at who wrote these reports, look at your local politician, look at your national politician, find their email, find their Twitter handle, find their Facebook, whatever you want, communicate to them, frame your story. Why should they care about your research? So think about what they do, think about what's effective for them, and think about how you can help make their job more straightforward and more impactful. So the key messages with policymakers: identify policymakers, read policy reports, contribute evidence, and connect with people. Reach out to these people. It's really important to do so. I'm just going to go through this engaging with the mass media, Simon, and then we'll go for a short break if that's okay.
Yep.
So thinking about your institute, use your press office. Your press office is an amazing resource, okay? So ask them to write a press release for your research. Make sure that you're listed on your directory of experts. So basically, media will get in contact with the university and say, hey, there's a story at the moment about volcanoes. Have you got an expert at your institute who can come and talk at a national or local level? So make sure you're listed there. And also ask them if they've got any training for how to do radio interviews or TV interviews or anything like that. Use your press office. They're an amazing resource. Write for the conversation. So the conversation has outlets in most of the countries of the people that are represented here. It's an amazing collaboration between journalists and researchers. You pitch an idea to them, you write the article with them, and then this normally gets picked up by many other media outlets. So I wrote an article for them recently around ChatGPT and plagiarism in higher education. As a result of that, I've been invited to Singapore Today. I've been invited to the BBC. I've been invited to BBC 4 times off the back of this. I've been invited to write articles for many other publications as well. And it's helped me to shape a grant research application. This was off the back of writing an article with the conversation. Write for the conversation. Identify opportunities. So look at current news, look at anniversaries, look at cultural events. Be clever with your research. How can you tie it into these things? How can you make it and provide context so that people want to find out more about what you're doing? And again, connect with people, reach out to journalists, find their email address, find their Twitter handle, find their LinkedIn profile, talk to them, share your work, get connected. So key messages: use your press office, write for the conversation, identify opportunities, and connect with people. I'll come back to that. Oh yeah, just very briefly, other audiences impacted by your research. Think about school children, think about community groups, think about activists, think about businesses. How can you reach out with them? How can you connect with them? How can your work make an impact for society and for you as a researcher? We're going to go into a brief break now. So I have it as 9 minutes to the hour. We'll come back on the hour and we'll continue. I think there might be a little video link that's going to go up. So Simon, I'll hand back over to you and I'll join people on the hour.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, just before we break, Sam, could we take a couple of questions now that have come up? There's some excellent questions coming in, and
yeah,
maybe
of course
we can deal with those, now while they're still hot, as they say. So I think this question came quite early on, and it really goes to the heart of your talk, and that is, how do you frame a topic that is difficult for a layman? Maybe laser light, particular proteins, something like that is very complex, but how do you convey that to a layman, was the question.
Okay, so it's a very good question.
There were a couple of answers actually that came in just from other participants, which were great. So
oh, great. Fantastic. Yeah. I mean, there's been so much conversation in the chat, which is great. I mean, the way I would say this is always ask your audience. So talk to your audience, like find out about your audience. What do they know? What don't they know? What are they interested in? And then work with representatives from that audience to try to frame it appropriately for them. So if you're talking to school children, for example, speak to some school children. What do they know about lasers? How can you develop stuff that's interesting for them? If you're talking to policymakers, find a policymaker, ask them. Don't ever assume, just talk to people about it. And I think that's the best way of framing messages, especially for complex research to all audiences.
Yeah, and one of the answers that came in was really sort of, which you highlighted in your presentation, and that is that however complex the subject is, you must demonstrate what the potential impact is on that layman's life. That there is a connection between astrophysics and what's going on in your daily life as a non-scientist. So somebody else said that analogy is a great tool. Physical props might be another. That was another couple of answers that came into that question. Couple more questions. So this is interesting. So pathos or pathos can be, the question is, pathos can be sort of, how do they say it here? Can be a catch-22. So you might be very passionate about the issues related to climate change, but the audience doesn't value it, and if they think they're not affected by it, so how do you bridge that gap? Where you're somebody who's very passionate, you think it's going to affect the world, somebody else says doesn't affect me, I'm not interested.
You listen to them and you ask them what their needs are, what they are interested in, and then you work together on developing that. It's not often that it'll be completely polarized, but people have different needs and people have different interests. So again, working with members of that community to understand rather than assume, it takes time as well, is really important. And you're not going to please all people, and you can't have a general message because there's no such thing as a general public. There's multiple publics, each of whom have different identities. And so it's really important to work with people from that community to understand, why do they feel like this? Yeah. And you're not necessarily trying to change their mind, because let's think about any conversation we have in the home. If you're going into a conversation thinking that person's trying to change my mind, that's not a conversation. Right. So really just thinking about having an open dialogue with people is a really effective way of doing that.
Yeah, and I think sort of a recurring theme in your presentation is just that you have to think about who your audience is and listen to them and sort of work back from that. Is that a fair fair?
Yeah, that's really
Yeah.
fair to say, Simon. Simon, I think I'll take one more question and then we'll break
Yeah.
if that's okay.
Okay.
So I've got a really good question here that I've seen, if that's
Go
okay.
ahead. Go ahead.
So Nidia basically asks, how do you sell yourself without sounding
Right.
arrogant
Excellent.
or feeling uneasy? In my culture, saying things like I have a H index of X might be seen as being arrogant and uncomfortable to say so. So I totally understand this, okay? Now, I'm British, right? British people are not very good at bigging themselves up. We're normally very, very humble.
Wow.
But you need to think about the bigger picture. And if you are an expert in something, it's okay to say so. It's not about me saying, I'm the greatest scientist in the world. I'm the greatest science communicator in the world. I can communicate anything. It's about being honest and being humble and saying, look, the reason that you should listen to me and that I know what I'm talking about is because here's my research. Here's 20 years of my life that I've dedicated to this field. And that's not being arrogant. It's about framing it in a way that is appropriate and that is humble as well. And again, thinking about the cultural sensitivities of your group. You might not want to start the presentation by saying, hi, listen to me. I've got a H index of 20. None of you know what you're talking about. All of you should be quiet and listen to me. That's arrogant.
Right.
If instead you say, I'm going to say some things in this presentation, and like, honestly, you can have confidence in what I'm saying because here's a body of research. Here's my H index that demonstrate I am a world leading expert in this field. That's okay to say. It's just about how you present it. And I understand that many people come from cultures where being humble is seen as the norm. It's the same in England with British people as well. You know, find it very difficult sometimes to say, I'm great, but that's not what I'm saying. I want people to listen to the research. So I frame it with my expertise so that people have confidence in me as a speaker.
Good.
So with that in mind, I'm just going to go on mute, turn off my camera. We'll come back at 5 past, if that's okay.
5 past is good. 5 past.
Yep. And then we'll finish at about 30, and then we'll take some more questions at the end.
And just for those of you who, on your break, my NSCDA colleagues, they're going to be putting up a poll, which we would be very grateful if you could answer at some point during the break, before or after you get your coffee or so. So they put the poll up here. Please help us by answering these questions.
응? BS.
So we'll make a start in about a minute's time. I guess we can end. Should I end the poll and then we can see what the responses have been? Might be quite interesting.
I think it's been ended. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And I think we'll probably maybe we'll present the results of the poll at the end of this session.
No, that would be great.
And we have another poll coming up. Not the end of the polls. We have another one coming up. Yeah, a fun one. Yeah. So.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, great. So I'll again, if I can just remind people when they join, they'll mute. Okay. I'm going to start talking again, and I'll aim to finish at about past, so we've got lots of time for questions.
Right.
Loads of people are sending me direct messages, which is great. Just also email me afterwards, because I won't be able to respond to you all in Zoom by the hour. Email me, as I'll come on to. I love talking to people and collaborating, so my inbox is always open. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen again, so you can see that. So I'm going to talk on now about making the most from social media, because people might not like it, but social media is a really important part of being an effective communicator in the 21st century and of making sure that your research has impact. So where do you start? There's so many different platforms. I mean, let's just look at this image here. This is already outdated because, you know, for example, TikTok's not on there, but we could have LinkedIn, Twitter, Snapchat, podcasts, Instagram, Vimeo, YouTube, Facebook, blogs, so many different platforms that it can become a little bit intimidating. So what I recommend is dip your toe and then focus. So pick 2 or 3 platforms, experiment with them, try them out until you have a platform that you feel comfortable with and that you feel is beneficial to you, to your research, and to your audience. Now, what would you say are the social media that scientists use? So this is from a paper in 2016 that looks at the different way that scientists use social media. And it's probably changed a little bit since then, but the one that they use the most is probably Twitter. And then the other, WordPress, Tumblr, Blogger, basically blogs. So social media that scientists probably use the most, and this is still true, would be Twitter and blogs. So I'm going to talk about Twitter and I'm going to talk about blogs. So Twitter, again, I'm sure you all know what Twitter is. It's a microblogging site. You can use 280 characters to communicate your work. And even though Twitter now has a new owner who people may or may not get on with, I would still say that it's a really effective and powerful tool for the reasons that I'm going to talk about now. So you can use it to promote your work. So whenever you have a blog, whenever you have a research paper, whenever you have some photographs from your fieldwork, you can use it to promote your work. You can learn to communicate concisely because you have to communicate in 280 characters or less. And so by doing so, it's a really, really good way of learning how to communicate your research succinctly to an audience. Find information, so you can find papers behind paywalls. So if you haven't got access to a paper, you can reach out to the researcher and ask them. You can have up-to-date conversations with your field. I use it for research. So if I'm doing research in terms of surveys and questionnaires, I can find participants, I can gather opinions. And it's a great way of virtually attending conferences. So we're not always able to attend all the conferences or seminars that we want to, but Most conferences and seminars have a hashtag associated with them, which is basically just an indexing tool. So we can use it to follow the conversation, even if we're not able to go to that conference or research symposium. But will it improve my citation count? So yes. So again, this 2015 paper showed that in PLOS One, those papers that were tweeted about versus those that weren't had a higher citation count, a slightly higher citation count. But let's think beyond citations for a second, because if you tweet about your research, it will have bigger impact. It will likely be more likely to reach policymakers, be more likely to reach journalists, be more likely to reach other audiences who can meaningfully engage with your work beyond that inward-facing scientists. So it's a great way of making sure other people can see your work. How do you use Twitter effectively? First of all, determine your USP, your unique selling point. So in my Twitter, I talk a lot about science communication, but also poetry and games, because that's where my research field lies. Share valuable content. So don't just talk about your work. Also share opportunities, share collaborations, share things that other people will find interesting or useful or funny. Try to always use images or GIFs or videos because they'll be viewed more. Tag people into the posts where you can, and be civil. You know, Twitter can unfortunately be quite an uncivil place sometimes. I always think you should never say something on Twitter that you wouldn't be prepared to say to someone's face, and just to be polite. And if we do that, we can use it as a really effective way to communicate our research to a variety of different audiences. I also use Twitter Analytics a lot. So Twitter Analytics is a great free tool because the free version of Twitter is still good. It's a great free tool to work out which of your tweets are connecting, which are getting a lot of views, what kind of thing do people appreciate. And by doing so, you can really work out which are the most effective. So you can see in January, my top mention was actually by the Indonesian version of the conversation. So again, right for the conversation. Blogs. So very, very, very briefly going to talk about blogs. So I have a blog called The Poetry of Science. So for people who don't know, my research, part of my research involves using poetry as a medium to communicate science to new audiences. If people would like, I can give another talk on that at another time, but that's basically what my research is. And I started a blog about this about 7 years ago, where every week I would read a piece of scientific research and write a poem about it in a way to communicate that research to a new audience. Now, I'm telling you this as a reason for why you need to do blogs. So I started this blog about 7 years ago. So the process is this. The idea being that I wanted to appeal to non-scientists or lay people, because science is amazing and interesting and important and relevant. But if people read just scientific abstracts, it's quite difficult and it maybe doesn't connect with them or inspire them. So I wanted to write poems as a way to hopefully bring scientific research to these new audiences. So for example, this is a piece of research, a really cool piece of research that found that migratory birds are actually lighter colored. So those birds that migrate are more likely to be light than dark. And this is the abstract, which is very well written from a scientific point of view, but actually very challenging for a non-scientist. So instead, I wrote this poem about it. You probably weren't expecting poetry in this presentation, but it does have a point. Clouds of feathers light up the sky, downy rainbows of keratin that flicker in the sun-kissed breeze. Weighed down by the heavy gaze of our restless star, you soar and sweat and rise. Kaleidoscopic promes bear you tenderly to the cooling folds of lofty winds, a lightness of touch mapped against the distance of retreat, black for home, white for elsewhere, coloration perfectly attuned to the passage of your flight. So whether you enjoy my poetry or not, which you don't have to, it's a different way of communicating to a non-scientific audience. So I have this blog. Every week I read a piece of scientific research, I write a poem about it and a short explainer as well to hopefully engage with people. Now, As a result of this, I actually published a research paper because people said, does it work? So I basically wrote a poem about an abstract, gave 50 scientists the abstract, gave 50 scientists the poem, and asked them to write about it. And then I did a thematic analysis of the two, and the work got published. So the blog has led to research publications. This is one research publication. It's also led to me giving keynotes across the world, to be invited to write books, to be invited to do grants. I started this blog. I had 10 readers a month when I started it in 2016. Last year, I had 190,000 views, 190,000 readers on my blog. So that's 190,000 people engaging with my work by starting a blog. It started with 10 readers a month. So I built this content from nothing by posting regularly, creating something original. And as a result of doing this blog, my profile's increased, I have bigger impact, I've been invited to give talks, I've created research papers, I've had successful grants, I've written books, I've been invited onto TV, onto radio, all from this blog. But will it improve my citation count? Again, yes. So the citation count, as proved in this journal here, the more people write about your research in blogs, the more it will be read, because even experts sometimes find scientific research difficult to understand. So if somebody else contextualizes it first and writes it in a way that's more accessible, more people will read that paper and more people will cite it. So how do we use blogs effectively? Find something new or a new way to say it. It doesn't have to be poetry. It doesn't have to be games. It just could be that your research is really interesting and you've got a really engaging way of talking about it as well. Thank you very much for the kind comments as well. It's very humbling for me to hear nice words said about me. Thank you. Post regularly. I recommend posting once a week, certainly once a fortnight. If that seems too much, then collaborate. Find 4 or 5 other researchers who can write with you around a broader topic. And then if you have 4 of you working together, that's 1 blog post a month. And then you have to do in order to have 1 a week. And it's a great way to connect and to network as well. Advertise yourself. Again, I know, I appreciate how difficult it is to do this, but people will not find you. People will rarely find you. You need to remind people what you're doing. And you can do that in a humble way. Have it on your email signature. Talk about it in presentations. So, you know, there's over 500 people in this webinar. I have mentioned my poetry blog to you, hopefully in a humble way, but I've advertised myself in doing so. So just think about opportunities for you and get involved with the blogging communities. Can you write for some other blogs? Can you invite people to write for you? How can you build those networks? How can you build those connections? So the key messages with social media: focus on 1 to 3 platforms. You can't do all of them. Develop an effective USP, unique selling point. Are you great at taking images? Use Instagram. Are you really good at audio? Use podcasts. Do you like making videos? Use YouTube. Post valuable content. Why would people like to want to go and view it? And collaborate and signal share. Work with others. Talk about other people's work. Work together to create this network away from your scientific research as well. So how do you evaluate your success? How do you evaluate if you're having impact or not? Because as scientists, you know, we're normally quite good at evaluating science. We need to turn that scientific mind onto our actual impact and science communication as well. First of all, use altmetrics. So almost all journal articles use altmetrics. It's an alternative metric system. It tells you where it's being tweeted about, where your article, so as well as citations, it's where's it being tweeted, where's it being blogged, is it on Wikipedia, is it on Reddit? And by using this, you can build impact. You can see what's resonating. You can share this with your research institute. You can use it for your promotional development as well. So just use altmetric. You can download an altmetric plugin for your web browser, but almost all research articles or papers have it or the equivalent of. Again, you can see here for one of my books, I have a very, very high altmetric because I was smart about it. So what I did was I said, I will give away 3 copies of my book to people who retweet this tweet. And the tweet had a link to the DOI of the journal in it, which meant that, you know, well over 1,000 people ended up retweeting this work. So lots and lots of people saw it. So just think smartly about how you can use your social media platforms to communicate and promote your work. Gather feedback, always gather feedback. So obviously I use Google Scholar or Scopus or Web of Science to see what your citation count is, what your H index is. Get qualitative feedback. So what are people saying about your work that's nice? Like, is it like colleagues, reviews, whatever? Keep a record of it. Like I keep a record of it because not only does it make me feel good about myself, but I can also use it when I'm developing like my CV, etc. as well. And then the X factor. So I always keep, this is like a screenshot of, I did a workshop for a school in Manchester recently, and all the school children wrote really nice messages for me, which was lovely. And I'm not going to use that, you know, to for my research institute to try and promote myself, but I keep it because it reminds me that communicating science is really important and I love what I do. So get the quantitative stats, get the qualitative examples, and just keep those things that kind of make you feel good about yourself and remind you why it is that you're doing science. Plan collaborations, okay? So I always think about how can you turn, I'm always thinking, how can I turn something into a research publication, a journal article, or a grant? Unfortunately, we do exist in a situation where we're judged on our research output and our grant revenue. I wish it wasn't like that, but we are. So in order for us to do the things that we find important, you have to play the game. And so how can we turn things into publications? So for example, back in 2017, I was asked to do a kind of like a science communication event across the whole of Manchester. And as a result of that, I met some people and we collaborated on putting together a special issue in Seminars in Cell Developmental Biology, of which I wrote 2 articles, both of which have been cited over 100 times, like combined. So plan those collaborations. What does that look like? Here's a collaboration to give you an example. So again, a lot of my research is around science and poetry. So a while ago, about 7 years ago, someone said, hey, Sam, you write poetry about science, and I have a poet friend called Dan Simpson who enjoys science. Why don't you meet for a coffee? So me and Dan met for a coffee on the left of the presentation here. And we really enjoyed, we liked each other and we wanted to do work together. So we wrote a short, basically theatre play that we then went to go and taught at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, where we talked about the relationship between science and poetry. And it was very well received. And that gave me the confidence to do more research in the field of science and poetry, which led to me publishing a book with Manchester University Press about a sonnet to science, which was about famous scientists who wrote poetry and why they wrote poetry. And then as a result of that, me and Dan have collaborated on many more projects, including Arts Council, so UK government funded projects, bringing scientists and poets together. I set up a journal called Consilience, which is a journal that basically uses peer review for poetry. I'll put it in the chat so that people can see it. But this is a journal that is now viewed about 7,000 or 8,000 times a month. And this all came from a coffee. So plan your collaborations, connect with people, meet people, think about how you can turn a coffee into a meaningful relationship and how that can then be turned into a research publication, into a grant, into future opportunities as well. Just reach out to people and make those connections. And then build recognition. So, work towards awards, work towards citations, and think about engagements. So, for example, I have a podcast also called The Poetry of Science, which now has almost 120,000 downloads. It's 120,000 people listening to my voice. So this is probably more people have heard me speak than have heard very, very famous scientists of the early 20th century. So just really think about building your voice, doing it in a humble way that's appropriate for you, and how you can capture that. So how are you getting the quantitative, the qualitative, and the X factor as well? So key messages to evaluate your success: use alt metrics, gather feedback, plan collaborations, and build recognition. So the last and final thing I want to talk about before we open the floor for questions is, when does impact begin? So does impact lead to research, or does research lead to impact? So my honest thought about this is that a lot of the time as researchers, we do research and then we're asked to think about the impact that that research is having on the wider society. I actually think we need to take a step back and think about society and how our research can impact them in a positive way. So all my responses to questions, I always say, ask the audience, talk to the audience, build those networks, ask them what they want, rather assume what they need. So these are two examples of research papers where I worked with the communities. On the one hand, people that were refugees and asylum seekers in the UK and wanted to find out about the climate crisis. And on the other hand, people who wanted to find out about how to design a board game or a card game around science. So I listened to those communities, and then I worked with them to create and develop research, rather than doing research and then trying to actively fit it into society. So be led by society in order to make meaningful impact. So to return to that contemporary definition, impact, the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society. Key messages for today's talk. 1, impact can be thought of as inward-facing and outward-facing. How am I having an impact in science? And how am I having an impact outside of science, with policymakers, with journalists, with community groups, with hospitals, with anybody that has a tangential relationship to my work? Think about which audience you want to engage with and frame your story accordingly by asking them, who are they? What are their needs? What do they want to find out about? How can you help them? Use social media to develop a digital footprint for you in your research. Try Twitter, try blogs, try Instagram. Like, I tried Instagram. It doesn't work for me because I'm terrible at taking photographs. I also have a blog, a podcast, a LinkedIn account, and Twitter. Anything more than that, I don't think I'd be able to also do research and teach. So set yourself boundaries, but experiment with them. Think about which are most effective for you, for your science, and for your audience. And then think about developing research from impact and not the other way around. As you're building those collaborations with communities, ask them what they need. What will help them? How can you create research that will be beneficial for them? And then in doing so, you can start to create a research pathway, collaborations that, yes, will lead to future grant success and publications, but will also just lead to that positive impact on society. So for further reading, again, trying to be humble, I have several books. You can find them on my website, but one book you might enjoy is Effective Science Communication, A Practical Guide to Surviving as a Scientist. Second edition of this with the IOP. There's actually a question about the IOP. They're a great place to publish with. They don't charge you money. If anyone ever asks you to pay money to publish with them, apart from article processing charges for open access, you should say no, because they're predatory. Like, people should be paying you, not the other way around. So the Institute of Physics are a very good place to publish. And so, yeah, check them out. And then finally, just to say, I'll have the Q&A. but please, please, please get in contact. I'm just going to put my email in the chat. I'm going to put my website in the chat, and then great. If we've got half an hour of questions now, which is great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But if anything that I've said today resonates, if like I know that not everyone feels comfortable answering questions in this environment, get in contact with me. If you want to collaborate on something, get in contact with me. If you want to talk about poetry, get in contact with me. If you want to talk about games, get in contact with me. If you want to have a virtual coffee, whatever, get in contact with me. I love collaborating with people. I love talking to people, and thank you very much for listening to this presentation. An hour and a half is a long time to listen and to speak. So really happy to answer all questions that we can get through. I think Simon and others are doing a good job of trying to facilitate them, and then I'll try to pick them up as well. So one final time, before I pass back on to Simon, I guess I will just share my Dropbox links with my slides, so they're there if you want them. Simon, do you want me to facilitate questions, or would you prefer to do so?
Well, just a couple of things. So first of all, Sam, thank you for an excellent presentation as always. I've heard your presentation or versions of it. This is not the first time, but I learn something new every time. And it's clear, just looking at the chat, it's clear that what you're presenting is clearly resonating with the audience, which is couldn't ask for a better outcome. There's just one housekeeping thing I'd like to, before I forget. Some of you, I think, couldn't complete the previous poll in time. So what we'll do at the end of the Q&A, we'll put it back up. And those of you who couldn't get your answers in there during the break, you'll have a chance to do it then. Maybe if I could just start with a couple of questions, Sam, that there seem to be sort of some themes here in terms of the questions that are being asked. One that's come up in different forms is how do you in terms of your social media presence, how do you balance what you put out personally and what you want to put out professionally? And I know that's a big question, but I think you've talked a lot about sort of sharing what your own experience is and so on, which can be quite personal. But then there's sort of the hard research you're doing, which you're also putting out there. So what are your comments on that balance?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. First thing you should always, everyone do, look at your institute's social media policy. This is really, really important. Now, a lot of times you can just make sure that you have something in your Twitter handle saying all tweets are my own, but just really think carefully, because every institute has a different social media policy. Read it. A lot of the time it's just make sure you're saying things that you are happy to stand behind and that are representative of the institute. So read the social media policy, always be polite, be civil, be nice. Why wouldn't you be nice in social media? And then I personally think it's up to you how much of yourself you want to reveal. So, I will be humorous on Twitter, but me personally will never talk about my family, will not really talk about my personal life, will not talk about a lot of my other interests, because that's what I think I use Twitter for. Others feel much more comfortable using that, and it's much more appropriate for them. So it's about, with all of these social media platforms, doing what you feel comfortable for you, what's going to help sell you, what's going to help sell your research, but always thinking those two things. What is your institute's social media policy, and how are you contributing in a positive way rather than adding to the negative and sometimes vitriolic comments that we have on social media? So be a force for positivity and good in the world rather than the other way around.
A related question, Sam, just in terms of sort of confidentiality and so on. Somebody's asked just that, when you're sort of publishing your research on social media or announcing your research on social media, and you might be interested in ultimately commercializing your technology, how do you balance that the confidentiality of your work with what you're sharing publicly?
Really good question. And it's not just for commerciality. It's, you know, you might want to publish it as well. And certain journals, you won't be able to publish it if you've shared it. First thing, always talk to your collaborators. Never share anything without talking to your collaborators. That also goes for research publication, like research talks. You shouldn't be sharing things in the public domain without talking to your collaborators, because it's just rude. Mm-hmm. Secondly, really carefully think about like, can I share a little bit of something and it's not going to impinge? So think about first, what do you want this to do? Is this going to form part of an intellectual property? Is it going to form part of a research paper? And again, talk to people, like talk to the impact and knowledge exchange people in your institute and get advice there as well. So I tend myself not to share research that's ongoing. I tend to only really share published results. But if I'm in a presentation, I will sometimes share work that's not been published. Again, first making sure that I've checked with my collaborators that doing so is appropriate.
One more, Sam, and then I'll maybe hand it over to you, just based on what you picked up on the chat. I guess it's people are, the questions are, I guess, how you've mentioned alt metrics and so on, but come back to, and I think you've made the point a few times, how do you choose which blog to use? I mean, for example, somebody here says they've been using WordPress, but they're wondering if they should use science blog that you use, you know, this kind of thing. So I think you've addressed it, but maybe just to remind people of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. I think it's basically about finding a platform that's easy to use and that is used by your audience. So again, Science Blog is really, that I use, it is built in WordPress, but Science Blog is kind of a broader, I guess, curation site. So they've already got an established network. So you could reach out to someone like them and say, hey, I've got an idea for a weekly blog. Can I publish with you as well? And don't be afraid to change. So if something becomes too much work or isn't getting resonation or is having no impact, then it's okay to change. Just following on from that, a lot of the questions are around, you know, as a researcher, I have to do research, I have to do teaching, I have to do admin. Like, how do I also find the time to communicate? Yes. Well, you have to, because as I was demonstrating, I do this for positive societal good, but I do it because it advances my career. Like, as by communicating my research, people find out about me. That's how I get invited to go and talk to NPR, to BBC, to BuzzFeed, for Scientific America. That's how people know. Think about research grants, right? Like, I sit on many grant panels. When you look at a review, a lot of the time you'll see someone's name on it. Like, people have biases. If people see my name attached to a review, they can't instantly separate me from that work. So they might think to themselves, oh, we've seen Sam here, here, and here. We know that he'll be able to do this well. It shouldn't work like that, but that's how it does work. Similarly, you know, it can lead, a lot of time, I'm writing my blog 5 hours a week, but it's worth every single hour of that, because as a result of that, it's led me to at least 3 book contracts, 7 research publications, like literally countless keynotes from Australia to Google. So why wouldn't I do that? And anyone who's saying you can't do that, it's a lie. I told you I started with 10 people reading that blog a month. That's all I did. And what I did was I developed effective content that I knew people would like to use. So let me pick up some more questions that have gone through. How do we communicate with potential collaborators with different goals to achieve win-win situations without causing conflicts of interest effectively? That's a really good question. Again, I'm sorry, this is all in my stock response, but it's listen. So don't go into a conversation or a collaboration thinking, I'm going to change that person's mind. Go into a conversation thinking, I want to find out more.
Sam, just hold on, Sam. I think we've lost you for a moment.
I can, oh,
Oh, you're back.
can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay, sorry.
okay.
So
Yeah.
it's just basically be respectful, like understand that everyone brings different things to that collaboration and value the difference of opinion as well. Let me pick up some more questions. So do you have any ideas on how to make your audience value what you do?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I'd ask you to flip it around. How can you bring value to your audience? It's not about you trying to make your audience think that you have value. It's about finding out how you can bring value to your audience. So what do they need? What are they interested in? And how can you measure that? How can you get those metrics? How can you see what's resonating? And how can you develop yourself as a profile as you go with that as well? Great to see everybody sharing their LinkedIn profiles and their Twitter handles and their email exchanges as well. Let me see what else
Can I ask just one here? Just
of
I
course.
think some words of maybe some words of encouragement or inspiration are needed. And I know you're very good at that. So this was an earlier question, but it was that have you ever, Sam, have you ever felt that your research wasn't connecting with your audience, and therefore you felt you're losing your motivation, becoming discouraged? So what did you do to kind of overcome those feelings and keep at it?
Okay, that's a really good point. Again, let's talk about research grants, okay? Because I think that's a really good example, and people don't talk about their failures enough. I have several successful research grants, but I also have many more unsuccessful research grants. I reckon I'm at 5% acceptance rate, okay? But the thing is, you just got to keep going. Think how many, there's 500 people in this webinar, right? That you're competing with 500 people, like at least. So you need to just keep going. But the thing is, don't keep going blindly. So even though I apply for a lot of things and have a lot of setbacks, every single one of those is a learning experience. So look at the feedback, and you might think to yourself, oh, that grant review panel didn't get me. But there's always something there. So you have to be humble. It's quite a dichotomy, but you have to have thick skin and you have to be humble. So be prepared to accept that some of the things might not be as good as they are, but also be prepared to fight your corner. My research is very niche. So a lot of the times people will say, oh, poetry, science, games, what's the point? So I constantly have to argue as to why my research is important. But in order to do that, I need to think about the audience, and I need to think about where they see value. So if I'm trying to talk to my research institute about the importance of my research, I need to talk about my research publications, my grant successes. So never be afraid when you have knockbacks. I have many more failures in my professional and also personal life than I do successes, but it's about learning from those and using each of those to continue on and to not get disheartened, and try not to take things personally. A lot of my failures, they're not personal, it's just you can't have everything funded. Anything else?
I have one for you, just on
of course.
funding proposals. So impact has been a recurring theme throughout your presentation. And I'm really looking for a comment from you, because what we see more and more with international research funding programs, when you look at the evaluation weighting, maybe 20 years ago, there was a much higher rating put on percentage put on the science, maybe less so on impact. And it seems that over the last, certainly last 10 years or so, that impact is increasing in weight in terms of the evaluation score. And just your views on that this, I think both impact and the need to avoid jargon, to talk in a language where evaluators, they don't know who you are. They don't necessarily are not experts in your field. So if you could just comment on that or elaborate on that point based on your own experience with
no, definitely. And I think, from the funder's point of view, you have to have impact, because otherwise, why are they funding your work? it needs to be having a positive impact on society, because the funders themselves then need to be able to speak to government or to their ultimate funders to say, this is what the point is. The best advice I can give with impact is you keep your scientific mind. So don't write the science statement and think about your science and do that all brilliantly, and then just go, oh, I'll do a talk or I'll go and visit a school. That's rubbish. Like, think intelligently, think smartly. How are you going to measure impact? What does successful impact look like? How are you going to evaluate it? How are you going to learn from it? Treat your impact as a science experiment, as a scientific process. And doing so will help you then to craft an impact narrative and develop effective impact that will work forward as well. I'm just going to, there's loads of quotes in the talks in the chat about being introverted or about coming from cultures where it's difficult to, I mean, okay, I'm a relatively extrovert person, that's fine, but you don't need to be an extrovert to succeed on social media. Like, you know, to have effective LinkedIn profiles or to have effective Twitter conversations. Similarly, you know, reaching out to people via email is a really, really effective way for introverts. Likewise, being on webinars and like having your camera off and stuff is absolutely fine. It's about finding processes that work fit for you rather than that work for somebody else, and finding collaborators that work with you as well and that work for you. I have lots of international collaborators, but I mainly work with them because I like them and I like working with them and I resonate with them. And not all of our work gets funded, but it's a great way of working together, basically. Okay, so a really good question here about fundamental research and people finding it difficult to how it can be applied to the public. How do we persuade in this case? So a lot of people will say, you know, if they're doing fundamental research on, like, let's say particle physics or like very, very fundamental biology, I still think it's really relevant to the public, but it's about, again, to various publics, thinking about the audience you want to connect with. There is no such thing as the general public. You know, people don't say, hi, I'm a member of the general public. People have different identities. You know, if they think about myself, I'm a scientist, but I'm also a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a runner, I'm a serious gamer, I'm a Leeds United football fan. Like, these are, I'm a Christian. These are all different identities that I'm English. These are all different identities that I have. And depending on that identity depends on how I will engage with something, be it science or not. You can't just assume what people want. You have to go and think about the audience that you want to engage with and ask them what their needs are. If it's an audience that you already resonate with, then you know that yourself as well. So really just think about asking people, working with them, and then you will find that even fundamental research has a lot of relevance to their day-to-day life by having those conversations as well.
So can we just take a little pause here? My colleagues would like to put up another poll. It's a fun poll, not a terribly serious. So put that up for a couple of minutes. So I think my NSEDA colleagues are will be sharing that now, and then we'll come back to the Q&A. So here are your instructions. Yeah.
If everybody just goes to Menti, which I'll also put into the chat so you can just click on it. I'll do this as well. And then you just enter that code and there'll be a series of questions for you to answer. It's really fun. So I'll do it as well. So I'm in Menti. Does someone need to start it? Because at the moment there's just the heart info for instructions, unless that is the the task to click on the heart. I think, although I'm not at the back end of it, sometimes, yeah, there we go.
I think,
So it should be
the
open
responses
now.
are coming in. Yeah.
Great.
Oh dear.
Oh.
That was not my idea, Sam.
No, this is very good. I also, I have to say, I'm purposely answering these wrongly, he says. I didn't read the question. I just clicked on my name.
Oh. Oh, there we go.
San.ဟုတ်တယ်ဟုတ်လို့နိုင်သွားတာအတန်in Jakarta
May sagutan pa?
Oh. Thailand. Okay.
The code is at the top of the screen for people. It's 33148328. I'll put it in the chat as well.
Circular economy biocircular
biocircular green economy.
Great. That's a great response. Okay.
Great. Well, that was a fun quiz. I don't know if someone might have been told that they won, but people were clearly paying more
I didn't
attention
win.
than me.
I did not win.
Great. So thank you for everyone for answering in the chat as well. Let me try to pick up some more questions as we go. Okay, cool. So Kian's asked a really good question. One question, since your work is revolving around science communication, it is understandable you have many resources and time for this. However, many of us working in the field or lab don't have time to regularly update this challenge. How can we do this? Do you have any experience related? Really good question. I used to be a postdoc in atmospheric physics, and I found the time to do this. Like, I set up a blog whilst I was there. I had a podcast whilst I was there. I had a Twitter account. And again, that actually, and then I did a lot of science communication work, which I then published because I thought about using my science brain to measure impact and think about outputs. And then as a result of doing that, I actually transitioned into the field of science communication. So I'm not saying you all need to transition into the field, but what I'm saying is that finding the time to do it will lead to opportunities that far outweigh the time that you put into it. But that is a very, very good question. And I totally agree that as a science, but even now, my research is very broad. It's not just science communication, but it's really important to find the time to do these things. Let me just see if there's any other questions I can pull up. Yeah, so how do you measure the impact quantitatively and qualitatively? Can you give some examples? So quantitatively, we'd look at altmetrics. So how many times it's been cited, how many times it's being tweeted, how many times it's appearing in Wikipedia, how many times it's on Reddit, how many times it's appeared in news articles. Qualitatively, people will write to you and say, hey, I really loved your research, or hey, I was inspired to do this, or people might comment on it as well. So just keep a handle on that. And then just, I tend to keep a record of most of these things so that I can look back on it, use it for my own CV. And then also when I'm feeling as though no one understands me, then it reminds me that people do understand me and do like my work. So I've probably screen grab a lot of the nice comments in the conversation today. So a really, really good question here about how do we convince our department on the importance of science communication beyond research or publication? Number one, ask them to invite me to come and talk to them. But more seriously, think about your audience. So what do these people care about? They care about research income and they care about publications, and they care about being featured in national and international news stories. So how can you think about that? How can you get your work covered by international and national news stories right for the conversation? How can you turn your work into publications? How can you apply for grants? So I'm not saying they're the only way, but I'm saying that's what I know. I'm at a research institute. That's what deans, that's what vice chancellors, that's what principals care about: money, publications, visibility. So how can you work towards that in order to do so? And I totally agree that science communication should be included in annual KPI and promotion criteria. Again, what I would suggest is that this generation of scientists can continue to push that agenda. So these are conversations that I continuously have as well. But it's about playing the game. So what do we know these people like? How can we do it? And then how can we create a situation in which we are then the people that are making the changes so that we can demonstrate that there is real value in this? But also that sometimes they have a point. We can't just be going out doing random science communication. Like, there needs to be a reason for it. We need to be able to monitor its evaluation. What is the hypothesis of our science communication activity? How have we answered that hypothesis? How have we measured our success? So just think about using your scientific brain when you're doing your science communication work as well.
And Sam, in your experience in submitting funding proposals, I would think that having this kind of that you're visible as a scientist, nationally and internationally, that can only help your chances of success in a funding proposal, right?
Of course, because as I was saying, people read your name against it. They can't help but do that. And also, sometimes funding is not open, and governments have funding that they will approach people for. So raising your visibility is really, really important. Okay. Maybe one more question, do you think, Simon, before we finish?
And then a couple of yes, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, great. So any advice to young researchers learning to approach potential collaborators? Really good question. So sometimes it can be really difficult to approach a well-known researcher in the field, like especially at a conference or something. Email them. Be really polite. Like, who's not? Imagine that you're a senior professor and you get an email saying, hello, I read your research paper. I really liked it. I'm really inspired by your work. I'd love to find out more and look at opportunities to work together maybe. Who doesn't like hearing that their work's great? Like, senior professors like hearing that their work is great, okay? They might not have the time for collaboration, but they often do. Like, I try to always make time for people who virtually contact me, like whether we have a coffee or a chat or anything. Just reach out, be polite, and then think about ways of developing that into a relationship as well. So yeah, I think that's all the time we've got for questions now.
Good. Well, thank you again, Sam. That was, as always, a wonderful presentation, very inspiring. And that's clear from all the comments that many of the participants today feel the same. Just some sort of bit of housekeeping and some information on what's happening next. We will be sharing the presentation with all of you that joined us today. So you'll receive an email from our ASEAN BCG colleagues. So that'll have Sam's presentation there. If you have any questions about the event today, you can email the ASEAN BCG network. We'll put up that email address for you. As I said, this is the second in a series of workshops and webinars. So we hope that you will continue to join us in the weeks ahead. And perhaps I could ask my NASDA colleagues to just put up the schedule, what's coming up, as well as the information on the next webinar. Beck or Pai, could you?
Simon, I
Yes.
already shared the slide. Let's see the slide.
No, we've still got Sam's presentation. I'm seeing Sam's presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So this is our next event. 1 week's time. 1 week today. This is with Nina Terol she's a Filipina, and she's going to be talking about how you can develop your research career by applying design thinking. And so please join us for this event, 4 p.m. Bangkok time next week. She is a very good presenter, very inspiring, and I think you can learn a lot just in terms of how to reflect on your own research career, where it is you want to go, how you can get there. So please join us for Dr. Nina Terol's presentation. Should we put up the schedule just of the remaining workshops coming up? Yeah. So as I said, Nina will be on the 22nd. Then we have a session basically a week later on management, another week later on collaboration, and then we've got a couple of sessions on scientific writing, also science communication, but really focusing on journal writing and writing proposals for international funding opportunities. So that's what's coming up. And then last of all, in April, late April, we've got a presentation on basically how you can build your international scientific network. So that actually follows very, very well from what Sam discussed today, how you can identify collaborators, how you can build a network that you can then go on to apply for funding together, publish together, et cetera. So that'll take place on the 27th of April. I think we said, Beck, that we would put up the poll again for those that couldn't get their answers down during the last break.
Excuse me, I have a question because based on the same schedule, it was set from 3 p.m. in Bangkok time. But when I see the poster, so of next week, it will start from 4 p.m. instead of 3 p.m.
Correct.
I would like to
Correct. Yeah, it was
confirm
originally
that.
scheduled for 3, but we had to shift that to 4 p.m. Bangkok time.
Okay, understand. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So here's the poll. If you didn't get a chance to reply earlier, please, we'll leave it up for a few minutes now. And once again, please join me in thanking Sam for a very inspiring, very optimistic, very encouraging presentation. Always good to see you, Sam. So thank you again.
Okay, Simon. So we will leave the poll in 2 minutes.
Okay, good.
Bye, everyone. See you next Wednesday. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you all for joining. Great
you.
session. And we look forward to seeing you in 1 week.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you next week.
Yep.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you
Thank you.
again, Sam.
Thank
Gracias.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.
One minute, guys. Fifteen seconds. Thank you, everyone. See you next Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you
Bye-bye.
soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.